Hello, my name is Sarah Whitcomb. I'm from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, an associate professor of school psychology, and thrilled to be part of the Birch Project funded by Boston Children's Hospital. Today, I'm going to share with you module number 6 in our series of screening modules. This one pertains to management of social, emotional, and behavioral screening data. I'd like to give credit to those who were really instrumental in pulling together the information for this module. My key doctoral students, Catherine Park, U Zhang, and Kelsey Gordon. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Birch co-director Melissa Perot from UMass Boston. The mission of the Birch Project, otherwise known as the Behavioral Health Integrated Resources for Children Project, is to provide professional development and resources for students and strengthen the coordination of behavioral health supports provided by school and community agencies. Please check out our website for resources and more information. As I mentioned earlier, we have a whole range of workshops provided to provide you with support related to screening efforts in your schools. This particular module is focused on management of social, emotional, and behavioral screening data. In this module, we will focus on these big ideas. We'll think about privacy as it pertains to data, access in terms of who has access to the data and are they easily accessible. We'll talk briefly about data collection processes, although they were covered quite extensively in the previous module. We'll talk about storage and think about the security of your data storage system. And we'll briefly touch on how to think about follow-up and sharing results with key stakeholders. So let's start with privacy. Our key questions here are data and privacy being protected? What should schools do to ensure the right to privacy in their system? When we think about right to privacy, we're really talking about FERPA, and we're thinking about how do we maintain adequate privacy controls consistent with our educational policy and laws. So FERPA being the Federal Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974 really is about ensuring that student data are protected and that they are accessible only to those that have a legitimate educational interest, such as current teachers and families. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act is less relevant in this case as we're thinking about the school setting, but could be relevant if we are sharing information with any outside providers. So what should schools do to ensure right to privacy in their system? First, they need to think about their system for how they carefully collect, store, and use the data that they are collecting, and really think about district guidelines in terms of who will have access to the data, where will it be stored, and how will it be used. And also thinking about how parents and caregivers are giving consent to collecting the information and how information might be shared with stakeholders in the future. When we think about access, we're talking about, again, our data accessible to those key stakeholders that have a legitimate educational interest in the information, and how do we develop this system? So when we think about who should have access, a lot of times when we're talking about social, emotional, behavioral screening, we're screening an entire population of students. And we're screening that population of students not only to target individual students that might need additional support, but also to think about aggregate forms of data that will help us understand our school population so we can adjust our overall instructional efforts in the school building. So given this population focus, of our screening efforts, a larger number of people will likely need access to the data. So it might be a tier one team focused on behavioral supports and social emotional learning in schools that need to have access to screening data so that they can be able to use that data to really understand whether or not their tier one efforts are working. When we think about what data should be accessed, we might think about our screening data, our mental health screening data that's integrated with other sources of data that are indicators of student well-being. So we might think about having access to data such as screening, attendance, nurse visits, disciplinary information, all in a way that's um, easily accessible for key stakeholders such as school team members to be able to develop some hypotheses and understand what's happening at a school-wide level, at a grade level, classroom level, and again, at the individual student level. When we think about how the system should be developed, we want to think again about, do we want access to data in a way that's integrated with other data collection efforts, such as attendance and disciplinary data? Do we want to think about developing a system that facilitates prompt analysis of the results so that we have easy access to data at multiple levels? Again, the student level, the classroom level, the grade level, and so forth. And we want to think about, how do we create these data management systems in a way that enable us to really have simple and easy access. So oftentimes schools will use a screening tool that's already embedded in another data management system, such as FastBridge or AimsWeb. And those data management systems also enable access to academic screening data. So then when we go to understand that data in a more comprehensive way, we can look at both academic and behavioral data together. Other schools might develop a system on their own where they're using a freely accessible screening tool and embedding it into a Google form or into a Qualtrics survey platform. And in that case, thinking about, how do we access those data um, in a way that's easily accessible for the key stakeholders will be important. As part of this, we also want to think about, how do we understand and consider data collection as part of our system, and how do we think about data collection in a way that ensures the validity and accuracy of our screening scores. So first, we might think about rolling this out with a realistic timeline and with lots of planning. So we want to think about our timelines for data collection. How often across the school year do we want to collect those data? Um, and in addition to how often we want to collect them, can we develop a calendar and give folks a window? So if it's a teacher report or a student report, do they have enough time to be able to accurately and reliably complete screening for a classroom of students? We also want to think about if professional development is needed. If we are adopting a new screening tool, we might want to provide our teaching staff and even our students who may be self-reporting, build a little professional development for everybody to understand a little bit more about the areas needed to be screened, why we're choosing these areas for screening, the value of social, emotional, and behavioral screening within a multi-tiered system of support, and how data are going to be collected, analyzed, communicated, and then used to inform intervention decisions. So things to avoid when we're trying to ensure a valid data collection process is to try to avoid hasty data collection, right? We don't want to just throw a social emotional screener out there, say, hey, everybody complete these forms for our students. and give them a small window of time, or do it in a way where teachers or respondents might feel pressured to get it done or completed, or other external challenges. So we really want to think carefully about the conditions that we set up to provide um, the right level of support to get this task accomplished in a way that can be reliable and valid and give us the best data possible. When we think about our data collection process, we need to think about whether or not we are going to enter our answers on a screening tool into an online data platform, or if we're going to use a paper pencil approach where we complete the screening measure in that way. And so we've got to think about what's available to your district. If you have a data management system that's already part of the resources available within your system, such as a data management system like Ames Web or FastBridge, or sometimes we've worked with schools who have used their student information systems and worked with the developers of those student information systems to build in the screening information that they'd like to collect. We want to kind of think about what platform you're going to use to not only enter the data, but then again, how you're going to hold on to those data and store them as well. So if you're thinking about accessing a screening tool via paper and pencil, then you'll have to consider how that's administered and then who will enter the data in a way that organizes the data for the stakeholders who will be making decisions with those data. So once you've figured out your data collection process as well as your storage, you want to think about, or as well as your management, then you want to think about your storage system and how you're ensuring that your data are securely stored. So first question is, where should you save those data? And then you want to think about who has access to the data. And then again, is the storage secure? So again, if you're thinking about an online platform, such as a FastBridge or a web-based system that your district purchases, you may be able to um, give particular people access to those data who need it. And typically those data are well secured as part of the agreement between the folks that develop the data management system and your school district. If you're using something like a Google form, you want to think carefully about how secure those data are, what kinds of privacy controls you have built into that system, whether or not you need a password to access the data, and so forth. When you're thinking about saving your data, so let's say you used a Google form as a way to collect screening data, and then you want to export those data into an Excel file, right? And you want to have that Excel file available to relevant team members or teachers. You might think about developing a system to de-identify student names. This is especially important if your data are ever going to travel outside of the school. So in some cases where you might be working as school systems with university partners who are helping you to make sense of your data or helping you develop systems for database decision making, you'll want to create a system where you're using student ID numbers or code numbers instead of student names, so that those data are not available to folks outside of your school system. So when we think about storage, we also might want to think about creating a process to screen for high quality data. In one way, you might want to have a system to screen those data, to identify any duplicate responses or fake or random patterns of responses or missing data. So, for example, you might notice in your scan of the data that for some reason all students with last names ending between S and Z are somehow not part of the data Excel file or the spreadsheet that you're using, which obviously indicates an error. So you might want to look into the administration or storing concerns that might have occurred. You might want to also have a process to, again, look at the outliers. Are there random responses, extremely high or low scores? Uh, you might want to have a system for thinking about, do you pull data out? Do you reconnect with a student and have them fill it out again? You might want to think carefully about what you do to ensure that your data are accurate. And then you want to think about your follow-up procedures. So when you think about a tiered approach to follow-up, you might first think about what you will do to scan the data and understand those students that are identifying in a high, moderate, or low risk range so that you can really create a clear, very clear schedule to respond right away to students that are falling within a high risk range. Those that are falling within moderate risk range, you might want to think about how you're going to respond or offer some sort of intervention within a week. This might indicate students that are in need of tier 2 intervention. And then for those students that are screening in the low risk range, you might be thinking about how do you communicate findings to teachers or to key stakeholders within a reasonable time frame to give an overall sort of picture of what the classroom looks like. Again, follow up is really considered in much more detail in the next module. But some key things to think about as you consider your follow up procedures in your school is to really think about aligning your screening process within a tiered approach. And when I say tiered approach, I really am referring to a multi tiered system of support. So, one thing you might do is develop a resource map of all of the school and community supports and services that you have at every different tier within your school. So, what are the universal instructional practices we have in place? What are the tier 2 interventions or the targeted interventions we have in place for some kids? And then, what are the more intensive interventions or community connected interventions that we offer for students who have more intensive needs? So, thinking through your resource map and thinking about how you're going to use your screening data to help target those kids that might be in need of more support, as well as think about how your data will help you to better understand your instructional practices at tier 1. Again, as I mentioned before, you'll want to think about those kids that are endorsing particular items that might indicate risk or harm to self so that you can engage in immediate follow-up. You also will want to think about how do you plan on sharing data or information with parents and guardians. So will you reach out to parents um, as you to, to access consent for tier 2 and tier 3 interventions if students are not already receiving those supports? What's your plan? What's your timeline for engaging in those practices? Also thinking about how you will follow up with school staff about screening and progress monitoring results. So creating a data plan that not only involves data collection and management, but really how are you going to go about sharing those data with key stakeholders? And do you have teams of community mental health providers or other professionals that engage in mental health supports within or as part of your school building, um, and ensure that they are ready and available in case high risk students need some additional support immediately. So thinking more about sharing results with stakeholders, and again, this is covered more in more detail in the next um, couple of modules. You will want to think a little bit again about who your stakeholders are and what information you'd like to share. So again, creating a system for how you share overall screening data with parents, how you reach out to individual parents for kids that need more individual targeted supports, what information teachers need, all staff need, students, district leaders, um, and how will you share that, right? Will you provide graphed data at grade levels or school levels um, over time to the key stakeholders to kind of show what's going on in your district and um, how those results maybe have changed over time with the introduction of various interventions. And of course, as I talk about sharing this information, you'll want to think really carefully about sharing information in a way that really meets the needs of the audience who you're sharing with. So if you're working with parents or community members who are not familiar with social emotional and behavioral screening, you'll want it to really reflect these data in a way that's as understandable and meaningful. And think about your timeline for how to share and when to share. Thank you so much for taking part in this module today. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. Dr. Catherine Kurtz is our project director of the Birch Project, and you can reach out to her. Also, subscribe to our mailing list. We'd love to hear from you. And please consider joining in on some of these other webinars related to screening. Thank you and take care.